Good afternoon. Welcome to HSG Family Day. Thank you for attending today. We're in a breakout session here with myself and Dr. Frank, where we're just going to talk about how we got to where we are and get to know us a little bit about why we do what we do, why we're passionate about HD clinical research. My name is Victor Sung. I'm a neurologist, an associate professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm the director of our HD program here. And we'll talk about how we got here and some interesting questions and dive a little deeper here. Dr. Frank, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. I wish that we could be in person meeting everyone, but this venue will have to do. My name is Dr. Sam Frank. I'm an associate professor of neurology at Beth Deaconess Medical Center, one of the Harvard Medical School teaching hospitals. And we're going to go into a little bit of detail about how we got to where we are and what we do. So let's start off with you, Dr. Sung. Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you grow up, maybe your med school, residency, and how you wound up going into movement disorders.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Frank. So I grew up actually in Texas. I'm a Texas native. We were talking earlier about with the playoffs going on. I grew up an Astros fan, and Dr. Frank is in Boston, where the Red Sox are playing. So by the time this airs, we'll know the outcome of that series. And then I was a neuroscience major as an undergrad at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And then I went back to Texas at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas for my medical school. And during my medical school, I did clinical research with Parkinson's disease patients. And that was my first exposure to movement disorders. And then I came to UAB for residency. And similarly, I tried to stay open. I liked all aspects of neurology, but I kept getting drawn back to the field of movement disorders. And so then I stayed on and did my fellowship, and then ultimately ended up picking up HD. And we'll talk about some other things that led me specifically to HD, but we'll leave that for the next question. What about you, Dr. Frank? How did you end up in movement disorders and your journey?
Well, my journey, as you said, I'm in Boston now, but I didn't start off here. I started off in Chicago on the north side. So really the Cubs are where my baseball heart is. But grew up there and did my undergrad at the University of Rochester. And that's where I met my wife. That's important for later. We then went to the University of Chicago, and I did a year of research looking at sleep and circadian rhythms. I really thought that I would be a sleep doc, actually. And then I went to med school at Boston University, spent the summer between first and second year interviewing people with Parkinson's disease, what kind of sleeping problems they had. Again, I thought I was going to be a sleep doc, but I really got hooked on the Parkinson's disease, on the dramatic changes and the therapies that we had for Parkinson's. This was in 1995. So things are a lot different now, but this was still remarkable at that point. So I knew that I was going to go into movement disorders. After I finished med school, I went back to the University of Rochester, where I did my internship, residency, and fellowship. And my fellowship was in experimental therapeutics, specifically focused on clinical trial work. And it was during my residency that I really cemented my interest in movement disorders. But it wasn't until fellowship, when I was in clinic with Ira Schulson and Carl Kieberts, Elise Kaysen, and a retired nurse, Nina Gardner, that I really became interested in Huntington's disease. And it was clinical research that got my interest to begin with. And I actually was in the room in the early days of Pharos with Ira and Elise when that was being designed as an intern, so before I even got to my fellowship. So that's where my clinical research career really was the seeds of it. I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got started, but first, Dr. Sung, tell me about your early clinical trial experiences and maybe your early experiences with Huntington Study Group.
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit and tell you a little bit more. So when I was finishing about my movement disorders fellowship, residency and fellowship, you're just going to the next step. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do for my first real job, and the opportunity came up. And you mentioned your wife. My wife is actually a psychiatrist. We met taking neuroscience courses together as an undergrad. But she went down the psychiatry route and I went down the neurology route. But I always have had an affinity for psychiatry and didn't mind psychiatric diseases. And so as I was finishing my fellowship, the former director of the Huntington's disease clinic here at UAB was moving on to a higher administrative position, and the position of the HD clinic director was open. And my chairman came to me and said, "Hey, are you looking for a job? If you will agree to be the HD clinic director, then I think we can write you up a contract that can be your niche to stay on as faculty." And I said, a job sounds good. And he, said, like, you like you've always had an affinity for the psychiatric aspects of neurologic diseases, and, HD kind of fits that. I was never daunted by psychiatric things. A lot of times I could just call my wife for a consult, and so it kind of seemed like a fit, and certainly having a job was going to be good. So I signed on, and that's how I started on as the HD clinic director here, and started on as faculty. That was back in 2010. And then, thinking about as a new academic faculty member, I knew I wasn't going to have a bench and do basic science research. And I knew my heart was really more towards clinical research. And as the newly minted HD clinic director, just to get certified to know what I was doing in HD, the first thing was to get certified to do the UHDRS. And to do that, I had to become an HSG member. And it was back in the day. I mean, this is funny stories, where to get certified to do the UHDRS, the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, Jody mailed me a DVD in the mail that I had to watch and then score onto paper, and then scan and email the scores back, and then mail the DVDs back to Jody. And then, I scored it well enough, and then I got certified that way. But interestingly, that DVD of videos was all taken in Venezuela with the original Venezuela project. And I remember I was looking down, scoring one of them, and I heard this voice that I knew on the video. And it was Dr. Nadi Stover, who's one of the other faculty here at UAB, in Venezuela conducting the exam. And I pulled her in and showed her the video, and she was like, "Oh, that's forever ago. I look so different." I'm like, "Nadi, you look exactly the same." But anyway, it was just a funny foray into it. And then my first HSG study was CREST-E, which was the study on creatine for HD. And my first any kind of clinical, any kind of meeting as a new faculty member was actually the HSG meeting in Indianapolis that year, if you remember that meeting. And I remember knowing nobody. And I was at a table with Francis Walker. And Francis Walker was more than happy to tell me about everybody. Anybody that stood up and talked, he would say, "Okay, that's this person, they're here, and this is their story with HD." And it really introduced me to this concept that the care of HD is really about stories. Patients and families all have stories, and that really resonated with me. A lot of our HD investigators have a story. And I could see very quickly the passion at my first HSG meeting that everyone had. And it just resonated with me. And it's finding kindred spirits, like, oh, these people are like me. I think this is the right community of people for me. And then once, like so many people, once we get into the HD research and care of HD patients and families, we're inspired to continue to do what we do because of the families. So, and the patients and the way their resilience and the way they rise up as a family to meet this disease head on, it's just so inspiring. So, well, what about you, Dr. Frank? What about your first HSG study and first experiences with HSG?
Well, being at the University of Rochester, home of HSG, in 2002, I remember Sandy Plum came out of her office and said, I need a medical monitor for the Tetrabenazine studies. Who's it going to be? And I looked at the person who was next to me, my fellow, and he was from Canada. He said, we've got Tetrabenazine in Canada. You take this one. So that was really the start of my career in research in Huntington Study Group. And so Sandy Plum was the project manager, and Fred Marshall was the PI. Francis Walker was the co-PI. And I dove in head first and really got to know research from that perspective, and sitting on steering committees and overseeing the safety of tetrabenazine, which of course was a huge job. It was a huge challenge. But it also introduced me to working with our partners in pharmaceutical company and working with the FDA. There was so much that I learned from that experience. And so that's how things started, and it only snowballed from there in terms of getting involved with various clinical trials.
And led to our first FDA-approved drug in HD, so that's awesome.
It did, yeah. And it really paved the way for other pharmaceutical companies to see that it could be done, and that there was a willing audience and willing participants. And it's amazing that everyone who, from the researcher and clinician side of things, recognizes exactly what you talked about, that it's a community, that it's really nice people who want to do good things for the patients and our families. And I think that that was how I got hooked on the clinical side, because people would come in all the time with being told myths from other physicians, from other family members, from the community. And we didn't have to do anything but teach them basics about Huntington's disease. And we provided so much support and reassurance and care that it was it felt like doing a good deed for the community, for the patient community. And then on top of that, we were looking for ways of slowing the progression of the disease. And these were the days, CREST-E and coenzyme Q10. So we were looking at all of those. I was involved with some of the pre-studies, prequel, pre-CREST, those pre-studies basically, and so it was really interesting to get involved on the clinical side of things as well as the clinical research. And once you get involved, once you see the people on the research side of things and how dedicated they are from a research and clinical perspective, it's hard to let that go. And you just want to get more involved. And we see the stories of our patients, and you're right, it's stories. It's not just a story, it's a family story, it's a multi-generational story. I follow so many patients, and residents will often say, how do you remember your patients? And I say, I'm not great at remembering names, but I can remember a good story, and everyone has a great story when it comes to Huntington's disease.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. For me, the story I always tell, well, one, just like you said, when I have medical students and residents come to clinic, before we go in with a patient, I'll say, okay, let me tell you the story of this patient and how they're related. My best family story is I was taking care of 3 siblings in a family with HD, and all 3 siblings had become estranged from each other through various life things, and were living in different parts of the state. And I had taken care of all 3 of these siblings for at least a couple years before any of us realized that they were related to each other because of marriages and different last names and stuff. I just didn't put it together that they were related. And one of the patients one day said, all my siblings have HD. And I said, oh, really? Who are your siblings? And then they said the name, like they said, well, my brother is so-and-so. And I said, oh, well, if that's your brother, then that means that this is your sister. And she was like, oh, my sister? And I said, yeah, she, I take care of her too. And they had lost touch through a variety of things. And so we scheduled their follow-up visits all on the same day, like the next time they came back. And they each came with their children, grandchildren, kinds of things. And it was like this huge family reunion in HD clinic. And there was lots of tears and laughter. And it was just a neat experience, and to be able to facilitate that. But I mean, HD is a family disease, and you get these family stories. It's really amazing.
What a great reunion story. That's really nice. I'm sure you have stories on the opposite side where families are driven apart because of death and because of things that happen within families in terms of HD. But it's always nice to hear the positive side of things. Just like when we don't have a cure, we don't have a way of slowing down the progression just yet. I know that there's a lot that's in development. But we've done so many different research projects through HSG. Tell us a little bit about some of the ones that you've been involved with and some of the positive experiences, not just in clinic, but through clinical research and how that has influenced your clinical care and how you interact with patients in the HD community.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge point, that just because we don't have a cure yet, or we don't have disease-modifying therapies yet, doesn't mean that we can't be doing research that incrementally does things, symptomatic therapies that can have huge impact on patients' lives. So I participated as an investigator in First HD. It was probably the biggest, well, it was and still is the largest clinical trial that I participated in as an investigator, and the most successful as well. Led to the FDA approval of Tetrabenazine, led by Dr. Frank. And there were so many things about that. I mean, I learned a lot about the conduct of a clinical trial, but also like the way that you and Claudia led that study. It was a lot about poise and adhering to doing things the right way so that we could generate good quality data, because that's the best way that we serve the community. And that trial certainly required a lot of endurance. It was long. There were bumps along the way, but how do we keep going and for our patients and do the right thing and do good quality work? And the way that has benefits at the end,
Yeah. I mean, in this case, the benefit was an approved drug that improved, not a cure, but improved some of the symptoms related to HD. And I think
and there's been so many things though, but like that drug, Tetrabenazine, I think people that don't really understand it and weren't part of the work, it's easy to say like, oh, it's just extended release Tetrabenazine, which is already out there, but it's so much more than that. And anytime you have good science that's put out there that seems almost too good to believe, people want to poke holes in it. And I remember seeing editorial articles or other people writing things like, well, the data looks good, but and they want to poke holes in it. But that's the thing, is if we do the science and just do the methodology in the right way, then it's hard to argue against. They can't really poke holes in it because it was done in a rigorous and very clean way. And I think that has benefits for our patients.
It's what HSG does is they generate great data with great people and lots of active participants who are willing to partake in the studies that we put forward. And I will never forget one of the investigators said, I don't think this drug is working. I said, why not? He said, I'm not seeing any side effects. And he was used to drugs with side effects. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think because we've done it in a systematic way, because we were collecting data in a way that objectively measured what was going on with people's movements, as well as the adverse effects possibly that the drug was had, that we were able to present good data and ultimately provide a treatment that made a difference for people in the community.
Yeah, and I think your point about side effects is great. I had one patient, he was on tetrabenazine, right? Because that's all we had. And it's a good drug, but he was having a lot of side effects, a lot of sedation. And I couldn't dose him any higher because he was already kind of sleeping all the time, and just kind of sedated all the time. And his movements weren't well enough controlled. And he knew, and he wasn't able to get into first HD, ARC HD, different reasons. So that this drug was coming, and waiting on it. And then once it was FDA approved, we switched him to do tetrabenazine. And his wife called like a week after we switched him. And her voicemail was so hard to understand because she was crying. And I thought it was something bad, surely something bad had happened. But she was crying because he had done so well with it. And that couple, they refer to do tetrabenazine as his Lazarus pill. Because when we switched him from tetrabenazine to do tetrabenazine, he had such a reduction in his sedation. It was like seeing him come back to life and be reanimated. And he could engage with the grandchildren again and things like that, things that he hadn't done in a while. And also we went to a higher dose and his movements were better too. So they are huge believers in it, and that's just one of many stories of a patient having a great benefit as a result of good, hard clinical trial work that's done by patients and investigators and coordinators. We all do it together, but together we can accomplish these things. And yes, it's not a cure, but what an impact this drug has on this patient and their whole family's life, just by just a symptomatic therapy.
Yeah,
So,
no, I never discount what we can do to make a difference in terms of people's lives, in terms of the symptomatic management. Yes, we want to find something that slows the progression, reverses damage, prevents onset. But in the meantime, we have to address the symptoms of today. So, and as you said, it's a team effort. It's a team approach. It's not just you and me. It is the nurses that we work with. It's the research staff. It's the people who do the contracts. I mean, there's so many people so far down the road that are involved in this team effort. So bring this back a little bit to you and me. In terms of HSG, this is a team effort. It's a team sport. And so I know that I've received a lot of support and mentorship and collaboration over the years. How do you think HSG has provided that kind of same career enhancement for you? What has HSG provided for you as an investigator that obviously you've turned around and given back to the community, but how do you think HSG has helped you as an investigator?
I think it's definitely clear. I think there's some of this in neurology, but I've not seen it even within the field of neurology anywhere like I've seen it within HSG. I feel like within HSG, all the investigators are always looking for that spark, that community, that next generation, and actively giving a helping hand to open doors for the next generation, like a proactive thing. I think about it like it's very much like sponsorship, not just mentorship. Mentorship is kind of like, hey, here's all the things that you need to do to accomplish your next steps, and now go out and do it, right? But sponsorship, which I've definitely seen in HSG, is actively going out and opening doors and creating opportunities. Let me make this connection for you. Oh, you want to do this? This is who you need to talk to. Let's walk over there at an HSG meeting. Let's go walk. Let me introduce you to so-and-so. This is who you need to meet. And those kinds of things. And it happens organically and smoothly. You know, I have to say, like, even with you and me, like, there was, you know, you were on the committee, one of those American Academy of Neurology committees.
Yes.
For movement disorders. And I was very young in my career and on faculty. And I think you and I had talked, we just had dinner together at the first HD investigator meeting or something like that, and kind of gotten to know each other a little bit. And then the next, you know, a few months later, I got an email from the American Academy of Neurology inviting me to kind of moderate one of the scientific sessions. I thought, how in the world am I getting this? Like, who at American Academy of Neurology knows me? Like, I'm so new. I literally have done nothing. How is this even possible? And then, you know, somehow we made the connection, I think, later that you were on the selection committee to choose. And just the intentionality of, I mean, you could have easily chosen the big names in the field who are well established, but the intentionality of understanding the way things go, that, like, I mean, Dr. Fahn, Dr. Jankovic, Dr. Scholson, they don't need more things to, you know, they don't need to moderate more of these sessions. I mean, they're already so established in the field, but intentionally looking out for the next generation, this kind of pay it forward mentality. And that's something that inspires me to do the same thing for the next generation, right? So I still feel, it still feels weird to me, but, you know, it's been over 10 years that I've been as a member of HSG and working in the HD field. So that's long enough that there is multiple generations behind me now and that are looking to me on who do I need to talk to? How can we make these connections? And so that mentality of, like, paying it forward is definitely there in HSG. And it's just so collegial. And it's hard to describe. There's an energy at these meetings that we all sorely miss because we're not in person, but we will be happy to get back to it as soon as we can, because we miss that. There's an energy, there's a community, there's this kind of unspoken bond that we all have. And we see it in each other, you know, like, oh, that person has the HD bug. You know, they've got it too. And we're always
it's very true. Very true. And what a great word, because mentorship you can find not easily, but it's there. But sponsorship, in addition, I think is really embedded into HSG and paying it forward to the next generation. And you're right. I specifically found people within HSG to moderate the sessions at the American Academy of Neurology because I knew you and I knew what your depth of knowledge was. And I think for a junior faculty member to be able to express yourself the way that you hadn't had the experience that a lot of people didn't have needed to be recognized. So I think that's a lot of what happens in HSG. And it really is a very nice community to be a part of.
I agree.
Great. Well, I know at least for me, HSG has provided so many opportunities from a career perspective. Getting involved on the executive committee and being involved in various studies and various roles, from the Data Safety Monitoring Board, a site investigator. I was the principal investigator for one of the studies. So a couple of the studies, I should say. And there are future opportunities too. HSG is always looking to expand, to partner, to get involved with other companies and to move the field forward. And I think that it's really a fantastic place to be. And so I guess if you were in charge of HSG or were speaking with Andy or Elise, our current leaders, what would you say are kind of the great things about what's going on with HSG right now? where do you think HSG should go for the future? What would, as an active clinician, as an active site investigator, as someone who's really been involved in a lot of studies, what do you think HSG's potential is, and where do you think we should go based on our strengths that we have today? And I know that's a big question. It's a big picture that I think a lot of us think about in HSG because the field is constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
We have two drugs now, which when I started with HSG in 2002, we had nothing. So what do you, from your perspective as an experienced investigator now, what do you think are the highlights of the HSG that will carry us forward to the future?
I think, some of it, the biggest thing in my mind is what we've already talked about, this sense of community, to contrast against our other movement disorders, right? I mean, I don't feel like there's this same sense of community that's engaged, the research community that's engaged with things like the Parkinson's study group, for example. It's not as tightly knit. And I think that's one of the strengths that HSG has, and that really is its currency going forward, is when you engage, if you're a pharmaceutical company, when you engage HSG, you engage the entire community, and the way that the community kind of activates together and activates with the same spirit. There is I think it's a two-way thing. The pharmaceutical company can get the whole community activated, but us as the community, there's a certain face validity and familiarity of, it's an HSG trial. If it's an HSG administered trial, then we know what to expect. We know some of these, hurdles like, I don't have to recertify on this thing. HSG holds all my certifications. They know what our qualifications are as a site for doing these things. And that's going to make getting the science going so much easier. And I think leveraging that to the future with future trials is important. I think there's so much good science happening in small to medium-sized companies that don't have their own army of CRO kind of thing already doing it. So that we'll need organizations like HSG to partner with and to really execute that. And all of us at as HSG sites, we have all of our patients that come with us too, right? And so for our patients, there's a familiarity there too. They know how things work when we do an HSG trial. And so I think that's the biggest thing. If I had to captain the ship of HSG, to really emphasize the importance of that. And it's important in so many things, like speed of getting a trial going, the cleanliness of the data, the execution of the study, and all of that stuff. Doing clinical trials is an expensive endeavor. It just is, So if you want to spend that money, you want to spend it well. And true. I think that's the value of HSG. As far as, where the future holds, who knows? There's so many, but it's exciting. There's lots of things coming. What I always say is, I'm sure you do too, Dr. Frank, give all the research update trials to your patients, research update talks to your patients and stuff. And the thing I always say is, every time I give that talk, like what's the latest in HD research, I find that I have to basically delete my whole slide set and start from scratch because everything is completely new. Like since the last time I did it, there's a few slides that I can recycle and update, but there's so many new things. I'm just adding in completely new slides every time, which speaks to the energy, the momentum that there is. And I think that's the future. The last HSG meeting that we had in person, I remember that very last session that we do, where it's like the research update session, where each pharmaceutical company that's starting out, like they get one slide and they get 5 minutes, right?
And they have to take full advantage of that time.
Yeah.
and they pile so much in. We always run behind during that session too.
Yeah. But that session, the thing I always talk about is it's standing room only. Everybody's packed in, everybody's engaged, and there is a buzz in the room. There's an electricity in the room because everybody feels it, like, this momentum of HD research. And I remember I had a medical student with me who had presented an abstract at HSG, and he was there for that last session. And he saw me taking vigorous notes as the companies were making these presentations. And he was like, "Oh, you're making your next research update lecture, right?" And I'm like, "Well, yes, kind of, but also this is this information that has never been presented anywhere before. This is brand new, like completely brand new. And so I've never heard this before, so I have to write it down because I'm not going to remember it, And he was like, "Oh, it's like that cutting edge." I'm like, "Yes, it's that cutting edge." And that's the feel of it. And like to be in that, like to feel like you're on the cusp of something or right on the leading edge of something. There's an excitement there that's kind of palpable. And it's, to me, one of the fun things about doing HD research and being a part of HSG, that we kind of ride this wave together,
It's true. There's such deep connections with everyone as a community. You can feel that excitement. And I do my best to come back after HSG and just try and share and spread that electricity to the rest of the staff that couldn't make it. Because there's always so much that's discussed. And it's true that it's sad that we haven't been able to get together, because it's that electric feeling that HSG is really our strength. And we have the community that's behind us. We have all of the people that are watching this, our families and patients that are so dedicated to helping us move science forward so that we can understand Huntington's disease, so we can develop new treatments. And do this as a community, as a partnership. And it's fun and it's interesting, and we change people's lives by doing what we're doing. So it's I think one of the reasons that we've prevented burnout during this time, because a lot of the research that I've been doing with HD, we've been able to continue through the pandemic. It hasn't been easy. But we'll get back to doing more. But telehealth may be here to stay. We're working on different ways of doing assessments remotely in various trials. So I think that's exciting implementation of technology into our studies. But you're right that studies are expensive. They take a lot. Companies invest tremendous dollars, tens of millions of dollars to get a drug to market at least. And so we have a ready-to-go network with patients that are so willing to volunteer and participate, because it's not just getting them in the door to sign the informed consent form. It's keeping them in the trial. It's making sure they know what's going on, truly informed consent along the way, and that retention, because people trust the staff at the places that they go to seek their care, because we've seen multiple generations of people, just like you see brothers and sisters. You can see parents and now children, and so we have to do right by these families, not just siblings, but multiple generations too. And people know that, and they trust us. So when we say it's a really exciting opportunity, here's a cool trial that's helping us understand Huntington's, or developing a new treatment for symptoms, or it has the possibility of slowing the progression, they trust us and they volunteer and they stay in. So it's exciting and it's cool that way too.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we're right about at our time, but thanks, Dr. Frank, for having a fun conversation, getting to know each other better. I think we know each other pretty well, but it's nice to tell some stories and talk about this amazing community that we have with HSG.
Always pick up new tidbits of each other and for HSG. So thank you for your time. I'm always looking forward to sessions like this with you and working with you and our colleagues at HSG in the future. And I know that we've got an excited family and patient community behind us to be our partners along the way. Thanks, everyone.